Melchizedek appears in the Bible for just a few verses and then disappears completely. But later scripture treats him as though he's one of the most important figures in the entire story. You see, that shouldn't happen. So what's going on here? In the next few minutes, you'll see why his appearance is so unusual and how later scripture builds directly upon it, and why the silence around him actually carries the meaning. In Genesis 14, Melchizedek appears suddenly and without introduction. He's called King of Salem and Priest of God Most High. And then the text moves on almost immediately. And here's the issue, because Genesis normally gives full lineage detail. This one began, that one appears again and again throughout the book. It names fathers, it names lines and how people are anchored in history. That's how Genesis works. It tells you where people come from and it tells you who they belong to within the larger story. It grounds every major figure in a clear family line. But when Melchizedek appears, none of that information is given. No father, no mother, and no genealogy are mentioned at all. He appears, interacts with Abraham, and then just disappears. That isn't just unusual for this book, it's a clear breaking pattern. And when a pattern breaks like this in a text, it usually matters because the structure itself is actually part of the meaning. Then much later in Psalm 110, something unexpected happens. A king is addressed and told he will be a priest forever after the order of who? Melchizedek himself. Now focus on that word, forever, because that's the shift. Nothing in Genesis suggests anything ongoing or permanent. Melchizedek appears once and then the narrative moves on. And yet, here he becomes the model for something enduring, not temporary, not symbolic, but something that continues, a priesthood that does not come to an end. So this isn't just a reference back to a historical figure. This is a category being defined using that same figure. It's a permanent priesthood tied to a brief appearance, and there's still no explanation connecting those two moments. No added detail, no expansion of his background, just an appearance in Genesis and an elevation in the book of Psalms. By the time you reach later Jewish writings, the pattern continues. Melchizedek is no longer treated as a historical figure. He begins to take on a much larger role in interpretation. He is described as a heavenly figure and as a judge and as someone connected to final redemption and restoration, which is a major development from the original passage. So, the progression moves from a brief unexplained encounter to a figure associated with judgment and the end of the story. And that's not a small step in interpretation. What's important is that this expansion builds on the same silence. No new biography is actually introduced and no origin story is added. The meaning increases while the original text remains minimal. Then the New Testament takes this one step further. And this is where the reading becomes very deliberate, because the silence itself becomes part of the argument itself. Melchizedek is described as without father or without a mother, without genealogy and without beginning or end, but Genesis never explicitly states those things. So what is happening here is a careful observation of the text. It's not adding information, but it's noticing what's missing and treating that absence as meaningful. No genealogy in the text becomes part of the meaning. No recorded beginning becomes part of the interpretation. No recorded ending becomes part of the pattern. This is not invention, it's a conclusion drawn from the text, based on what the text includes and what it leaves out. The silence itself is being read as intentional. Because if the structure was intentional from the start, then the silence is not a gap or a missing detail. It becomes part of the design of the text itself. Melchizedek appears once with no origin and no genealogy, no clear beginning and no recorded ending in the text. And yet, he becomes the model of an eternal priesthood. Not because the text explains everything about him, but because the text leaves him open in a specific way. And that openness is what later scripture develops. So, maybe the question isn't just who Melchizedek is. Maybe the deeper question is why he's written in this way and what that structure is meant to point towards.